The rifle was already raised when Raymond Watkins rode onto Ruby Aldridge's claim. She stood in the open doorway of her small wooden house, the morning sun just barely cresting the red rock ridgeline behind her, and she did not flinch. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders, her jaw was set like poured iron, and the long barrel of her father's Winchester was pointed directly at Raymond's chest, with the kind of steady certainty that told him this was not the first time she had aimed it at a man and meant every inch of it. Raymond pulled his horse to a halt 20 feet from her front step. Dust swirled up around the animal's hooves and settled slowly in the dry Arizona heat. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same red rock as the ridgeline behind her. He wore a dark hat pulled low and a leather vest over a faded blue shirt, and there was something in his eyes when he looked at her that did not match the hard set of his mouth. "Miss Aldridge," he said. His voice was low and even, the way a man speaks when he is trying very hard not to give anything away. "You ride another step closer, Mr. Watkins, and I will ventilate that hat of yours in ways you will find deeply inconvenient," Ruby said. He almost smiled. She could see it at the corner of his mouth, fighting to get out and failing. "Your father's rifle," he said. "I recognize it. Then you know I know how to use it. I came to talk." "Burke Calloway sent you to run me off this land," she said. "That is not talking. That is threatening with extra steps." He said nothing to that, which told her she was right. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut, and somewhere up on the ridge, a hawk turned slow circles in the burning blue sky, watching them both with the patient indifference of a creature that had watched men and women fail each other 1,000 times before and expected nothing different this time. But Raymond Watkins did not ride another step closer, and Ruby Aldridge did not pull the trigger. That moment, suspended in the dry Arizona morning of 1882, was not the beginning of their story. It was the place where everything that had come before it either broke or held. It had started 6 weeks earlier, in the town of Cabo Rojo, which was not much of a town by any stretch, a main street with a general store, a land office, a saloon called the Rusty Nail, a livery, a small church that doubled as the school on weekday mornings, and a scattering of houses and outbuildings that spread out into the scrubland like something thrown by accident. The railroad had not come to Cabo Rojo and likely never would, which meant that everything that arrived and everything that left traveled the same dirt roads that had been worn into the earth by boots and wagon wheels and the hooves of horses over the previous 3 decades. Ruby had arrived by stagecoach on a Wednesday afternoon in late September with 2 trunks, a carpet bag, a rifle case, and a deed to 160 acres of land in her coat pocket. She was 24 years old. She had dark eyes that saw everything at once, and a directness about her that some people found refreshing and most found alarming. She had grown up in Santa Fe, the daughter of George Aldridge, who had been a surveyor and a man of particular stubbornness, and she had learned from him not only how to read land and water and weather, but also how to stand absolutely still when something was trying to move her. George Aldridge had staked his claim in Arizona territory under the Homestead Act of 1862, and had been working it for 3 years when his heart gave out in the summer of 1882. He had managed to cultivate a modest portion of the land, had dug a well that struck clean water at 30 feet, and had built a 1-room house of timber and adobe that was more solid than it looked. He had left all of it to his daughter. Ruby had come to keep it. She had not come because the land was worth a fortune. 160 acres of Arizona scrubland was not going to make anyone rich on its own. She had come because it was the only thing left of her father, because he had built it with his own hands and had wanted it kept, and because something in her own bones had a deep and particular hatred of being told she could not do something. The trouble was Burke Calloway. Burke Calloway was 47 years old, weathered and wiry and ruthless in the particular way of men who had started with nothing, and had mistaken cruelty for strength on the way to accumulating something. He owned the Callaway Ranch, which was the largest cattle operation in the Cabo Rojo Basin, covering nearly 12,000 acres of deeded land and another vast stretch of open range that he treated as his own personal territory, with the kind of certainty that comes from having enough armed men on your payroll that most people do not argue the point. George Aldridge's claim sat on the eastern edge of Callaway's range. It was not valuable because of the land itself. It was valuable because the well on that claim was the only reliable water source within 3 miles, and whoever controlled that water could, in a dry year, hold enormous power over the movement of cattle across that stretch of country. Callaway had been trying to buy the claim from George Aldridge for 2 years before the old man died, and George had refused him every single time with a politeness that was somehow more infuriating than open hostility. When Ruby arrived to take possession of the claim, Callaway sent his land agent, a nervous man named Pollard, to the land office to explain that the deed was not properly filed and that there were questions about the survey, and that it would be in everyone's interest if Miss Aldridge would simply accept a fair price for the property and return to wherever she had come from. Ruby had stood in the land office with the deed in one hand and her father's survey notes in the other, and had systematically dismantled every single one of Pollard's objections in front of the land commissioner, a tired but honest man named Gerald Fitch, who had reviewed the documentation and confirmed that the claim was valid, properly registered, and entirely Ruby Aldridge's to do with as she saw fit. Callaway had been furious. She had heard about it secondhand from Mabel Crow, who ran the dry goods counter at the general store and had appointed herself Cabo Rojo's unofficial newspaper. Mabel had told her, with wide eyes and a lowered voice, that Callaway had put his fist through the wall of his own dining room upon hearing the news, and that he had gone around telling people that the Aldridge girl would not last the month. Ruby had bought seeds at the general store, 2 new shovels, and a box of rifle cartridges. She had moved into her father's house and started working. She had met Raymond Watkins on her 3rd day in Cabo Rojo, though she had not known who he was at the time. She had been at the livery, negotiating the boarding of a horse she intended to purchase for working the land, when he had walked in from the back of the barn leading a tall roan mare with a long red mane that moved like water. He was the kind of man you noticed not because he was showy about it, but because there was something in how he carried himself, a kind of careful, contained ease that made the air in a room feel slightly different. She had looked at the mare first, because the horse was genuinely beautiful. He had said, "She does not like strangers coming at her from the left side," and Ruby had paused with her hand already extended toward the mare's nose and looked at him sideways. "Thank you," she had said, and had come at the horse from the right, and the mare had dropped her head and accepted the greeting with the soft dignity of a well-kept animal. "You handle horses well," he said. It was not flattery, it was an observation. "My father taught me." She had not looked at him again, focused on the mare. "Are you selling her?" "No, she is mine." She had looked at him then fully, in the way she looked at everything, directly, without apology. He had looked back at her with the same quality, and there had been something uncomfortable and interesting about it, like 2 people who both speak the same very specific language and are surprised to find it used correctly by someone else. She had bought a good bay gelding from the livery keeper instead, paid a fair price, and left. She had not learned his name until the following day, when she had been at the Rusty Nail getting a meal, the only place in Cabo Rojo that served food in the evenings, and Mabel Crow had appeared at her elbow like a friendly ghost and told her in a tone of considerable significance that the man she had apparently spoken to at the livery was Raymond Watkins, Burke Calloway's head rider, and widely considered the best horseman in the whole of the Cabo Rojo Basin, which included some very good horsemen. Ruby had chewed her bread and considered this information. "He works for Callaway?" she had asked. "Has for 4 years, Mabel confirmed. "He came up from Texas after some trouble down there. Nobody knows exactly what kind of trouble. He keeps to himself mostly. He is polite enough, but he does not say much." She had paused. "He was watching you from across the room just now." Ruby had not looked up. "A lot of people are watching me." This was different, Mabel said, and left it at that. It had taken Ruby another week to settle into the work and the rhythm of the land. And in that week, she had learned several things that confirmed what she had already suspected about her situation. She learned that the two nearest neighboring claim holders, a man named Duval and another named Peterson, had both sold to Calloway in the previous year, one under significant financial pressure, and the other after a fence-line dispute that had turned ugly enough that Peterson had loaded his family into a wagon and left without looking back. She learned that Calloway's riders made regular passes along the edge of her claim, not close enough to be clearly trespassing, but close enough to make the message plain. She learned that Gerald Fitch at the land office was an honest man but a cautious one, and that when she asked him quietly whether anyone in town would be willing to help her if Calloway escalated, he had looked at his desk and not answered, which was its own kind of answer. She also learned that the creek that cut across the northern corner of her land was listed in her father's notes as seasonal, but was, in the fall wet season, running stronger than expected. Her father had written about it extensively, had noted where it could be diverted to irrigate a wider strip of land, had sketched out a system of channels with the careful precision of a man who had been a surveyor all his life. Ruby had read those notes like scripture. She had started digging the first channel on a Tuesday morning, alone, in the early light before the heat came up, working with the methodical energy of someone who has decided on a thing and has no particular interest in discussing it further. She was still digging when Raymond Watkins rode by on his regular pass along the claim boundary. He had pulled up without quite meaning to. She could feel it, the pause, the weight of being watched, and she did not stop working. She drove the shovel into the earth and turned the soil and drove it in again. He had sat there on his roan mare for a full 2 minutes before he rode on. He came back the next morning at the same time, and the morning after that. On the fourth morning she was digging and she said, without looking up, "If you are going to watch me work, you might as well make yourself useful." A long pause. Then, to her considerable surprise, she heard him dismount. He did not take the other shovel. He crouched beside the channel she had dug and looked at the line of it, the angle, the way she had calculated the slope. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Your father planned this." Yes, he knew what he was doing. He always did. She drove the shovel in. He just ran out of time. Something in that sentence hung between them in the early morning air. Raymond stood up slowly and looked out across the land toward the creek, then back at the line of the channel, and she could see him thinking, following the logic of what her father had intended, and something in his face changed slightly, the way a man's face changes when he is confronted with something he finds genuinely interesting and has not expected to find. "The diversion point needs to be 6 feet further upstream," he said. "Or you will lose the gradient." Ruby stopped digging. She looked at the ground, traced his reasoning, and realized he was right. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you." He nodded once, got back on his horse, and rode away. That night she lay in her father's house in the single room with its adobe walls, and its one glass window and its wooden floor that her father had laid himself, plank by careful plank, and she looked at the ceiling and thought about the man who worked for Burke Calloway and had just helped her lay out an irrigation channel that Calloway would absolutely not want her to complete. She did not trust him. But she was honest enough with herself to admit that she was thinking about him. Raymond Watkins, for his part, was having his own private war. He had worked for Burke Calloway for 4 years, and in that time he had done his job with the competence and reliability that had quickly made him indispensable. He rode the boundaries, managed the other hands, negotiated with cattle buyers and neighboring ranchers, and kept the machinery of the Calloway operation running with an efficiency that Calloway valued enough to pay him considerably better than anyone else on the payroll. What Calloway did not know, And what Raymond had no intention of telling him was that Raymond had started keeping his own records 4 months ago. It had begun with something small, a discrepancy in the branding logs that Raymond had noticed when checking cattle tallies after a roundup. A few head more than had been registered. He had mentioned it to Calloway's foreman, a man named Garrett, and Garrett had looked at him with the particular blankness of a man who knows exactly what you are talking about and has no intention of discussing it. And Raymond had understood in that moment that the discrepancy was not an error. Calloway was running a rustling operation on the side, small enough to stay beneath the notice of the larger cattle associations, but persistent enough to be profitable, moving stolen cattle through a set of intermediaries to markets in Tucson and Phoenix, where nobody asked too many questions about brands that had been worked over. Raymond had been raised by a father who had very strong opinions about stealing, and in particular about men who stole from other men who had less than they did, and who used their power and their wealth to make the theft invisible. His father had been a small rancher in Texas who had lost his operation to exactly that kind of theft and that kind of power, and the experience had shaped Raymond into a man for whom honesty was not a philosophy but something closer to a physical need, like breathing. He had begun recording what he saw: dates, numbers, brands, the names of the middlemen he could identify. He was building a case. He did not know yet exactly what he was going to do with it, because going to the local sheriff was not an option. The sheriff of Cabo Rojo County was a man named Dobbins who played poker with Calloway every Friday night and owed him more money than he was ever likely to repay. He was thinking about the federal marshal's office in Tucson, but he needed more evidence, and he needed to survive long enough to get it there. In the meantime, he had been riding the boundary of the Aldridge claim every morning because Calloway had told him to keep an eye on the girl and report back when she showed any sign of giving up or giving in. What Calloway had not understood, because it had not occurred to him that it was something he needed to specify, was that keeping an eye on someone and acting against them were two different things, and Raymond had been making a careful distinction between those two things since the moment Ruby Aldridge had appeared in that doorway of her father's house with her jaw set, and her hands already busy with the work of staying. He had told Calloway that she was making slow progress and seemed likely to find the work overwhelming before long. This was a lie. She was making remarkable progress and showed no sign of finding anything overwhelming. He justified the lie to himself on the grounds that Calloway was a criminal and therefore not owed truthful reporting. He did not examine too carefully the additional fact that watching Ruby Aldridge work had begun to be the part of his day he thought about most between sunrise and the time it actually came. It was the 4th week of October when things shifted. Ruby had completed the first irrigation channel and had started on the second, and the water running from the creek along her father's planned route had already darkened a strip of earth that had looked dead and was now showing the early green of emerging growth. It was not dramatic yet, but it was real, and it was the kind of real that said this woman knows exactly what she is doing, and she is not stopping. Raymond had arrived that morning to find her not digging, but standing very still in the middle of the property, looking at 3 fence posts that had been pulled out of the ground and thrown into a pile. The fence line those posts had belonged to ran along the western edge of her claim, separating her land from the open range that Calloway's cattle crossed. Without the posts, without the wire, the boundary was gone. He reined in and looked at the posts, then at her face. "When?" he asked. "Last night, sometime after dark." Her voice was completely even. This frightened him more than anger would have. Ruby. He had not meant to use her first name. It came out before he could stop it, and she looked at him sharply, and then something happened in her eyes that was not the hard mineral certainty he was used to seeing there, something that was softer and more complicated, and that she shut down very quickly. "I did not do this," he said. "I know," she said. The directness of that, the absence of accusation, the simple statement of belief, hit him somewhere he was not prepared for. He sat on his horse and looked at her and felt himself standing at the edge of something he had been carefully avoiding for 4 weeks. "Garrett," he said. It was not a question. She said, "He had 2 other men with him. I heard horses, but I did not go out. I knew better than to go out alone in the dark." She looked at the posts. "I need to reset them today." "I will help you." She looked at him. Really looked at him, the searching, total attention that he had first seen directed at his horse and had thought at the time was remarkable in a person. "Why?" she asked. Not unkindly, genuinely. He thought about all the things he could say. He thought about the records he kept in the inside pocket of his vest. He thought about his father's small Texas ranch and the way the land had looked after they were forced to leave it. He thought about riding this boundary for 4 weeks and watching this woman build something that everyone around her was trying to destroy. He said, "Because it is right." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once. The way she had nodded at him the very first time he had said something useful to her, with the particular economy of a person who does not perform gratitude but means it completely. They spent the rest of the morning resetting the fence posts, and while they worked they talked, not about Calloway or about danger or about any of the forces that were pressing down on her claim from all sides, but about other things. About the land. About water and soil and the way her father had read the country like a text, understanding its grammar, its seasonal logic, its hidden resources. Ruby talked about her father with a grief that was not raw but was very present. A grief that had been worked into something functional, and Raymond listened to her the way he listened to everything with his whole attention, quietly, not filling silences that did not need to be filled. She asked him about Texas. He told her more than he had told anyone in 4 years, about the ranch, about his father, about the loss of it. He did not tell her about the records in his vest or the plans for Tucson. Not yet. But he told her enough that she looked at him differently after that, and he could feel the difference. It was not comfortable, exactly. It was the particular discomfort of being seen accurately by someone whose accuracy you respect. Calloway summoned Raymond to the main ranch house that evening. The Calloway ranch was everything Ruby's claim was not large, imposing, fully built out, with a main house of timber and stone that had cost more money than most people in the territory would see in a lifetime. Calloway sat behind a wide desk in his study and looked at Raymond with the calculating focus of a man who has never fully trusted anyone but has learned to use people with precision. "She is still there," Calloway said. "She is still there," Raymond confirmed. "Garrett tells me the fence line situation did not persuade her," Raymond said carefully. "She reset the posts." "Alone," he held Calloway's gaze. "She is resourceful." Calloway leaned back. "I want her gone, Raymond. The dry season comes in 60 days. Without that well, my eastern range loses 20% of its grazing capacity. I have run the numbers. That woman is sitting on something I need." He said it the way a man says everything, as pure calculation, with the human element factored out entirely. "I want you to go up there tomorrow morning and make her an offer, final offer, enough money to start over somewhere comfortable, and make her understand that the offer does not stay open." Raymond said, "And if she refuses?" Calloway looked at him. "Then you explain what refusing looks like." The silence in the study was a particular kind of silence, the silence of a man who is deciding who he is. Raymond rode out the next morning. He rode to Ruby's claim because Calloway had sent him. He rode knowing that Ruby had seen men like Calloway before, had prepared for men like Calloway before, and would not be persuaded by money or frightened by implications. He rode knowing that when he got there and she refused, and she would refuse, he would have to make a choice that would end everything he had built in Cabo Rojo and possibly get him killed. He had spent half the night with the records from his vest spread out on the small table in his bunkhouse room, looking at them in the light of a kerosene lamp, adding the most recent figures he had gathered, and making sure everything was documented carefully enough to withstand scrutiny. She was in the doorway when he crested the rise toward her house, and the rifle was already up. He pulled his horse to a stop 20 feet out. "Miss Aldridge," he said. You ride another step closer, Mr. Watkins, and I will ventilate that hat of yours in ways you will find deeply inconvenient. The almost smile came and went. He said, I came to talk. Burke Calloway sent you to run me off this land. He looked at her. The morning sun was coming up behind the ridgeline, and it caught in her dark hair and turned the Winchester barrel into a thin line of light, and she was the most fearless thing he had ever seen in his life, and his chest hurt with something that was not quite simple admiration. Yes, he said quietly. He did. She had expected the denial. The honesty of it threw her off balance just slightly. He could see it in the minute shift of her expression, the fractional rearrangement of her certainty. She did not lower the rifle. Then say what he sent you to say, she said. He reached into his coat pocket and took out an envelope. He held it up so she could see it. He sent an offer, money, enough to go somewhere and start again. He paused, and an implication about what happens if you refuse. How much? He named the figure. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said he would pay that for this land, and he thinks that amount is meant to be generous. The water is worth more than the land to him. The water is worth everything to me, she said. It is how my father built this. It is how I am going to keep it. She looked at him over the barrel. What is the implication exactly? That the offer does not stay open. A pause. The hawk was back on the ridge, or another hawk that looked exactly like it. The silence between them had a different quality than it had had a minute ago. It was not the taut wire of confrontation anymore. It was something quieter and more complicated. Raymond, she said, his name in her mouth for the first time with the same directness she gave to everything. Why did you really come? He looked at the envelope in his hand. He looked at the rifle. He looked at her face, which was asking him an honest question and deserved an honest answer. I came, he said slowly, to give you this. He set the envelope on the ground in front of his horse. And to tell you that I will not be riding for Burke Calloway after today. She stared at him. There are things I have been keeping, he said. About Calloway, records, evidence of criminal activity that has been going on for the better part of 2 years. I have been waiting until I had enough to take to the federal marshal in Tucson. He reached into his vest and took out the folded sheaf of papers that had lived there for 4 months. He held them up in his other hand. I have enough. The rifle lowered 2 inches. Not all the way, 2 inches. You have been building a case against him, she said. It was not disbelief. It was the sound of someone calibrating new information against existing intuition and finding that it fits. While riding his range and looking at his cattle, he said, yes, and reporting to him that I was likely to give up soon. Yes, that was a lie. It was a calculated misrepresentation for the purpose of buying time, he said. I was raised to consider lying a serious matter, so I want to be precise about that. Something happened in her face that was entirely new. It started at the corners of her eyes and moved to her mouth, and it was, against all probability, the beginning of a laugh that she was absolutely not going to let out right now. But it was there. She lowered the rifle, not because she was certain of him, not because the danger was gone, but because she had looked at him with that total attention for 4 weeks, and she understood what she was looking at. And what she was looking at was a man who, in the worst possible position, had chosen the harder right thing over the easier wrong one, and she had been her father's daughter long enough to know that this was one of the rarest things there was. You need to ride to Tucson, she said. I know. And Calloway is going to know you turned when you do not come back with my answer. I know that too. She looked at him for a long moment. The morning had gotten brighter around them, and the heat was starting to build in the way it did in October in Arizona territory, that particular dry warmth that had a weight to it like a hand pressed flat against everything. She said, before you go, come in and have coffee. My father kept a good supply. He tied his horse to the post outside her door and ducked into the low frame of her house, and she put the rifle in the corner and set a pot on the iron stove, and they sat across a small wooden table from each other in the one-room house that her father had built. And he spread his records on the table between them, and she read every page with the careful attention of a woman who had grown up reading survey notes and land deeds, and understood documentation. And when she had finished, she looked up at him and said, "This is enough. This is more than enough. I know. Why did you wait?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the papers. He said, "I wanted it to be airtight. I did not want to give him any room." A pause. "And I wanted to make sure you were going to be all right before I went." She looked at him across the table. The morning light came through the single glass window and fell across the papers between them and across his hands, which were large and calloused and completely still. She said very quietly, "That is not a small thing, Raymond." "No," he agreed. "I suppose it is not." She refilled his coffee without being asked, and he watched her move in the small space of the house, efficient, unhurried, completely at home in a place she had occupied for barely a month. And he thought clearly and irreversibly that he had never wanted to be in a room with someone as much as he wanted to be in this room with her, and that he was going to have to ride to Tucson immediately and then come back to tell her so, because some things had to be done in the right order. He rode out 2 hours later. Calloway knew something was wrong before Raymond reached the main gate of the ranch. One of the hands who had been out early had seen Raymond at the Aldridge claim and had seen him go inside and had ridden back to the ranch to report, because there were men on Calloway's payroll whose job it was to watch and report on everything, including, apparently, Raymond himself. Calloway was at the corral when Raymond came back, and his face had the flat, closed quality of a man who is extremely angry and has decided to be precise about it. Raymond did not slow down at the corral. He rode straight to the bunkhouse, went inside, picked up the small bag he kept packed under his bunk, a habit from years of being a man who understood that circumstances can change overnight, and came back out. Calloway was standing in the yard. "Pollard tells me you were inside her house for 2 hours, Calloway said. Raymond looked at him from the saddle. He felt the weight of 4 years in this moment, 4 years of doing good work for a dishonest man, 4 years of keeping his head down and building his case and waiting. And now the waiting was over and the weight was gone, and what was left was something clean and uncomplicated. He said, "I am leaving your employment, Mr. Calloway." Calloway's eyes narrowed. "You have something of mine. I have records I made myself, of things I observed in the course of my work," Raymond said. "They belong to me." He paused. "Or more accurately, they belong to the federal marshal's office in Tucson, which is where I am going." The silence that followed was not the kind of silence you fill with words. Calloway's hand was near his hip. Raymond watched his hand with the calm attention of someone who has thought this through and has decided that if it comes to this, it comes to this. Garrett stepped out of the barn. Another hand, a man named Wick, appeared at the corner of the bunkhouse. Raymond said, clearly enough for all of them to hear, "I have made additional copies of everything in those records. They are in sealed envelopes addressed to the marshal's office, held by a private party who has instructions about what to do with them if I do not arrive in Tucson within 4 days." This was not entirely true. There was one copy, given to Gerald Fitch at the land office that morning with exactly those instructions, but the specifics of it did not matter as much as the certainty with which he said it. Calloway stared at him, calculating, measuring. Then, with the careful rationality of a man who values his own survival above his pride, he stepped back. Raymond rode out of the Calloway ranch gate at a trot and did not look back. He made Tucson in 2.5 days, pushing his roan mare hard but not cruelly, camping light and sleeping little. The federal marshal's office was on Congress Street, a brick building with a government seal on the door and 2 deputies playing cards in the front room, and the marshal himself was a man named Harlan Voss who had been doing this work for 12 years, and who read Raymond's records with the focused silence of a man who has been waiting for exactly this kind of material. "This is good work," Voss said, turning the last page. "I have been gathering it for 4 months. Rustling operation, fraudulent deeds, and what appears to be extortion of at least 2 neighboring property holders." Voss looked up. "Who is the woman on the Aldridge claim?" "Ruby Aldridge, George Aldridge's daughter. She arrived 5 weeks ago to take possession under the inheritance." Calloway has been pressuring her. Actively. Fence posts pulled out, ongoing boundary harassment, and he sent me to make a final offer yesterday morning with an implied threat. Voss nodded slowly. I will need a few days to organize a proper approach. I want to take him with enough documentation that there is no way for a local court to dismiss it. That means federal charges, not county. He looked at Raymond steadily. Are you willing to testify? That is why I am here, Raymond said. He spent 2 days in Tucson while Voss assembled his deputies and prepared the federal warrant. In that time, he wrote a letter to Ruby. He was not a man who found writing easy. He was better with his hands and with silence, and with the kind of communication that happens when two people are paying close attention to the same thing. But he wrote it carefully, 3 drafts, until it said what he meant. He told her that the marshal had the evidence and was preparing to move. He told her that she should expect Calloway to make some kind of final move before Voss arrived, because men like Calloway did not wait passively for consequences to find them. He told her that Garrett was the most dangerous element, not Calloway himself, who was strategic, but Garrett, who was not particularly strategic and had a temper that Calloway had always managed carefully and which, without that management, was unpredictable. He sealed the letter and paid a rider he trusted to carry it to Cabo Rojo on the fastest horse in the livery stable, with instructions to put it directly into Ruby Aldridge's hands and no one else's. Then he wrote a second, shorter letter, which he folded and held for a moment before he sealed it. This one said, I would like, when this is finished, to ask you something that is not about land or water or Burke Calloway. If that is agreeable to you, please leave the light in your window on. He almost did not send it. Then he sent it because he was a man who believed in being honest and direct, and because he was tired of waiting for the right order to do things when the right order might be now. Ruby received the first letter on the morning of the second day, after Raymond left. She read it standing in her doorway in the early light, and when she finished reading, she looked out across her land, the channels that were running now, the strip of darkened earth, the fence posts standing straight in their repaired line, and she thought about what he had said about Garrett. She spent the rest of the morning making preparations. She moved her father's strongbox, which contained the deed, her father's survey notes, and the copy of Raymond's records that Gerald Fitch had passed along to her after Raymond delivered his original, to the floor of the root cellar her father had dug beneath the main room, covered it with a loose plank and then a braided rug. She checked her rifle and her revolver, which was a single-action Colt Army Model 1860 that her father had carried for 20 years, cleaned and loaded and sitting in the holster on the wall peg, where she had been putting it every morning for 3 weeks. She checked the well. She checked the water in the channels. She did the ordinary work of the morning with the particular focus of a person who has decided not to be afraid but has resolved to be extremely careful. The second letter arrived 2 hours after the first, delivered by a red-faced young rider who handed it over and left immediately without explanation. She stood in the middle of her main room and read it. She read it once quickly, and then read it again slowly. Then she looked at the window. She thought about the light in the window for the rest of the afternoon. Garrett came at dusk. There were 3 of them, Garrett and Wick, and a third man she did not recognize. They came from the north, crossing her land from the direction of the open range rather than the road, which told her they were not interested in pretending this was anything other than what it was. They rode up to her house in the last red light and stopped in a rough line in front of the door. Garrett was a large man, weathered and hostile, with the particular air of someone who has always used physical intimidation as a substitute for thought. He looked at her standing in the doorway and said, Calloway says you have 3 hours to pack and go. Calloway is going to be occupied with federal marshals in approximately 48 hours, Ruby said. He is not really in a position to be issuing ultimatums. This was a guess about the timing, based on what Raymond had written. But it was a calculated guess, and she said it with the same flat certainty she said everything. Garrett's face did something complicated. Then he said, That is not our concern. Our concern is that you leave. I am not leaving. Garrett looked at her for a long moment. Then he dismounted. Ruby raised the Winchester. I will use this, she said. It was not a warning so much as a statement of fact, delivered in the same tone she might use to note that it was going to rain tomorrow. Garrett stopped moving. Wick and the third man stayed on their horses, and she could see that neither of them was particularly committed to being here. They were men doing a job, and the job had just become considerably more complicated than the version they had been told about. Garrett was the problem. Garrett was the true believer, the one who had wrapped his identity around Calloway's authority, and was now finding that authority crumbling and was having the reaction of a man who does not have very many ideas and has just lost the only one he had. You are one woman with one rifle, Garrett said. And you are one man with one very short future if you take another step, Ruby said. I have documentation of everything Calloway has done in this territory for the last 2 years. The federal marshal has the original copies. I have additional copies. You are standing in front of a woman you cannot afford to harm and on land that is not yours, and the men behind you know it even if you have not caught up yet. She watched Wick and the third man exchange a look. She watched the third man turn his horse quietly, without drama, and ride away. She watched Wick look at the retreating back and then at Garrett and make the calculation that took about 3 seconds and ended with him turning his horse and following. Garrett stood alone in the red evening light in front of her door. He was a big man suddenly reduced to just his own company, and without the others behind him the inflation of his presence collapsed into something smaller and older and more tired. He looked at the rifle. He looked at her face. He did not try to reach for his own gun. He said through gritted teeth, "This is not over." "Go home, Mr. Garrett," Ruby said. "You want to be clear of this when the marshal arrives." He stood there for another moment. Then he got back on his horse and rode away north. Ruby stood in her doorway until the sound of hoofbeats had fully faded into the dark, and the night sounds had come back. The crickets and the distant coyotes and the soft, persistent music of the creek running through her channels. And then she went inside and lit the lamp and set it in her window. Marshal Harlan Voss arrived in Cabo Rojo with 6 deputies the following morning. Burke Calloway was arrested at his ranch house before noon. The federal warrant served with the particular quiet efficiency of a man who had done this many times and understood that noise was unnecessary. The arrest was on charges of cattle rustling, fraud, extortion, and intimidation of a homesteader under federal land laws. Garrett was arrested at the bunkhouse. 3 other members of the operation, identified in Raymond's records, were taken before the end of the day. Gerald Fitch at the land office, who had been quietly terrified for 2 years, and was now experiencing the complicated relief of a man who had waited out a storm he did not know how to stop, provided supporting documents from his files that corroborated everything in Raymond's records. Raymond rode into Cabo Rojo with the deputy marshal's party, having joined them in the camp they had made 8 miles out the previous night. He rode directly past the Calloway ranch and the activity there, Calloway in handcuffs, Garrett arguing with deputies, the whole machinery of the operation being systematically dismantled without stopping, because the thing he needed to do first was in a different direction. He rode to Ruby's claim. She was outside when he came, working on the 3rd channel, driving a shovel into the earth with the same steady economy that had stopped him in his tracks 4 weeks ago. She heard him coming and looked up, and the morning light was the same as it always was, hard and clear and honest, and she looked at him across the open ground the way she always looked at everything, with her whole attention. He pulled up and got down from his horse. They stood 10 feet apart and looked at each other with the particular quality of 2 people who have been through something together and are standing on the other side of it. "Calloway is arrested," he said. "I know. I heard them ride past earlier." She looked at him. "You look like you have not slept in 3 days. 2.5, he said. She looked at the shovel in her hands and then set it aside, tines down in the earth. She said, "Your letter." "I know it was forward," he said. "You do not have to." "The light was in the window," she said. He was quiet. He looked at her. The morning had that particular stillness that happens sometimes in October in Arizona territory when the heat has not quite arrived yet, and the sky is perfectly clear, and everything within range of human perception is very sharp and very present. He said, "I want to stay. Not on this land necessarily. I would need to find work. I have some savings, but not enough to—" "Raymond," she said. He stopped. "I know you want to stay," she said. "I know because you already stayed in every way that matters before you had any reason to think I would let you." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Your father built a good thing here." "He did," she said. "I intend to keep building it." A pause. "I would like to keep building it with you." He crossed the 10 feet between them in 3 steps, and she looked up at him. He was taller than her by several inches, and he put his hand against the side of her face, the way a man touches something he wants to be absolutely certain is real. And she put her hand over his, and the morning held them both in its clear, ordinary light, like something that had been waiting to happen for longer than either of them had known they were waiting. He kissed her once carefully, and she kissed him back with the same quality she brought to everything completely, without reservation, with her whole self. And the creek ran through the channels in the ground her father had planned, and the hawk turned on the ridge, and the October sun climbed higher in the Arizona sky. The weeks that followed were the hardest and the best of Ruby's life, which she later reflected was how the best things usually arrived. Hard because the work of a claim was genuinely hard, especially going into winter, and the irrigation channels needed to be fully completed before the seasonal creek began to drop, and the house needed winterizing, and the soil that was being cultivated needed to be turned and prepared for the spring planting season. Hard because Calloway's arrest, while a massive relief, had also removed the structure of power that had organized most of the economic life of Cabo Rojo, and the town was in a period of adjustment that created its own uncertainties and frictions. Best because Raymond was there. He had found work quickly. There were 3 neighboring ranches that had been operating in Calloway's shadow and were now, with that shadow lifted, looking to expand their own operations, and a man with Raymond's reputation and skills had his pick of positions. He accepted a foreman's role at the nearest of them, a small but solid operation owned by a man named Hector Vargas who had come up from Sonora 15 years earlier and had built something honest and careful, and who paid Raymond fairly and treated his workers with a basic human decency that Raymond had been missing for 4 years. He did not move onto Ruby's claim. That was not how it was done, and they were both people who cared how things were done. But he was there every morning before the ranch work began, helping with the channels and the fencing and the winterization, and most evenings after, sitting across the wooden table where he had spread his records weeks ago, eating food that Ruby made with the same focused competence she brought to everything, talking about the land and the work, and the plans for spring, and the 1,000 other things that 2 people who are genuinely interested in each other talk about when they have decided to stop being cautious. He asked her to marry him on a Sunday in November, which was the day of the week she had always said she liked best because the light on Sunday afternoons in Arizona had a particular quality that her father had talked about, and that she had come to associate with all the things she loved most. He asked her the way he did everything important, directly, without preamble, standing in front of her in the afternoon light, having thought about every word beforehand and then put the words away and just said what was true. He said, "Ruby, I have been in love with you since approximately the 4th morning I watched you dig irrigation channels at 6 o'clock in October, and I would like to spend the rest of my life watching you build things, if you will let me." She looked at him with the total, clear attention he had come to understand was the highest compliment she could pay anything, and she said, "Yes, Raymond, I will absolutely let you." They were married in the small church in Cabo Rojo on the 15th of December, 1882, on a cold, bright morning with the mountains white with snow above the red rock ridgeline, and most of the town in attendance, because the story of Ruby Aldridge and the Calloway claim had become the town's story, the story of something that had been wrong for a long time and had been made right, and people wanted to be present for the good part. Gerald Fitch stood as a witness. Mabel Crow cried with the particular enthusiasm of someone who had sensed this outcome early and wanted credit for it. Hector Vargas brought his wife and 3 children and sat in the front pew and looked at Raymond with the satisfaction of a man who hires well. Ruby wore a dress she had altered herself from the best fabric available at Mabel's dry goods counter, dark blue wool with a high collar, and she carried nothing except her own stillness and her own certainty, which had always been more than enough. Raymond wore his cleanest shirt and his good hat, and he looked at her walking toward him in the church, and his face did the thing it almost never did, which was to show everything at once, and everyone in the church saw it, and it made Mabel Crow cry harder. They went home to the claim that evening. Her father's house, which was now their house, felt different with 2 people in it, not crowded, but inhabited in a fuller way, the way a space feels when all its potential is being used. Raymond brought a few things from his bunkhouse at the Vargas ranch: a small chest of drawers, a couple of books, a photograph of his father's Texas ranch that he set on the shelf above the stove where he could see it from the table. Ruby saw him look at it that first night, and she stood beside him and looked at it with him: a flat Texas landscape, a small house, a rail fence, the sharp particular quality of a photograph taken in the 1870s. She took his hand and held it. "We will build something better," she said, "something that stays." He looked at her, and she was still the most fearless thing he had ever seen, and he said, "We already are." The winter was cold and the work was constant, but the house was warm, and the partnership that had been forming since October deepened through those cold months into something that had the quality of a thing that has found its proper shape. They complemented each other in ways that neither of them had entirely anticipated. She was quick and analytical, reading situations and problems with the speed of her father's surveyor's mind. He was patient and methodical, understanding structure and sequence with the kind of clarity that comes from years of managing the complex logistics of large-scale ranch work. Together, they could see further and work harder than either of them could alone. In January, Ruby began drawing plans for an expansion of the house. She did it the way her father had planned everything carefully, with measurements, calculating costs against their combined savings, thinking through the sequence of construction. She spread the plans on the table, and Raymond looked them over with the same focused attention he gave to anything she showed him, asking questions, suggesting modifications, pushing back on 2 structural choices that he thought were under-engineered, and being right about both of them. The expansion they planned was modest but meaningful. Another room, a proper kitchen with a larger stove, a covered porch on the eastern side where the morning light was best. They planned to build it in the spring, when the ground thawed and the weather allowed. The federal court case against Calloway proceeded through the winter. Raymond had testified in December, a 2-day proceeding in Tucson that he had ridden down for and ridden back from in the same week, and which had gone exactly as Marshal Voss had promised. The records were airtight. The additional documentation from Gerald Fitch and 2 other witnesses had filled in any remaining gaps, and the federal prosecutor had built a case that gave Calloway's lawyer very little room to work in. Calloway was convicted in February 1883 on 12 counts of cattle rustling and fraud, and 4 counts of extortion, and was sentenced to 15 years in the federal penitentiary in Yuma. Garrett received 8 years. Wick, the hand who had ridden away that evening at Ruby's claim rather than follow Garrett's lead, had cooperated with the marshal's investigation and received a suspended sentence. Ruby had spoken on his behalf at the request of the prosecutor, who had asked if she could characterize his behavior that night, and she had told the court that, when faced with a choice between following an unlawful order and walking away, Wick had walked away, and that this counted for something. The judge had agreed. The Calloway Ranch itself was broken up. The land that had been fraudulently acquired reverted under federal order to the original claimants or their heirs, where those could be identified. The remainder was divided into 4 separate operations and sold at public auction, the proceeds going partly to the federal court costs and partly to a restitution fund for those who had suffered losses under Calloway's operation. The 2 previous claim holders who had been pressured into selling, Duval and the Peterson family, both received restitution payments, and the Petersons, who had moved only as far as Flagstaff, returned to Cabo Rojo in March and began rebuilding. The basin changed. It was not immediate or total or without friction. The removal of a major organizing force is always complicated, and there were businesses in Cabo Rojo that had depended on Calloway's patronage and were struggling to reorient. But there was also a collective exhale, a sense of space returning to a place that had been compressed for too long, and people who had been quiet out of caution became louder out of relief. Mabel Crow, whose dry goods counter was the unofficial information exchange of Cabo Rojo, reported all of it in her running commentary to anyone who would listen. And she always included, with the pride of a person who had seen something important early, the part about how Ruby Aldridge had stood in her doorway with George Aldridge's rifle and held her claim against everything Calloway had sent at her and had been still standing when it was all over. And how the man Calloway had sent to run her off had been the one who had ended Calloway himself. Ruby, when she heard this version, said to Mabel, "That is not quite how it happened." Mabel said, "It is how it happened in the part that matters." Ruby thought about this and decided that Mabel was not entirely wrong. Spring came to the Cabo Rojo Basin with the particular force that spring had in that country, sudden and flowering and extravagant after the cold months, the desert blooming in colors that seemed impossible for something so dry, the creek running full and silver through the channels that were now fully established and working exactly as her father had designed them. They broke ground on the expansion in March. Raymond worked on it every day he was not at the Vargas Ranch, and Ruby worked alongside him, and they argued productively about the porch. She wanted it wider than the plans called for, and he said the beam load needed to be recalculated if they widened it. And they spent an entire evening with paper and pencil working through the calculations together, which ended with Ruby being right about the feasibility and Raymond being right about the required beam size, and both of them being satisfied. By May, the new room was framed and roofed and the porch was built, and the house had grown into something that looked the way it had felt inside all winter, fully inhabited, complete, shaped by the specific people who lived in it. She told him she was expecting a child on a warm evening in May, sitting on the new porch in the last light, watching the irrigated strip of land where the green had come in thick and purposeful after the spring planting. She said it the way she said everything, directly, without decoration, looking at him. He sat very still for a moment. Then he said, "Oh," in the particular tone of someone for whom a thing has become real all at once in a way that is too large for any other response. And she laughed, the laugh that had been trying to get out since the morning he had told her about his calibrated misrepresentation. And he looked at her laugh with the expression of a man who has just realized he would like to spend the rest of his life watching that specific thing happen. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat on the porch that they had argued over and built together, and watched the green come up out of the ground that her father had wanted to keep. And the evening was full of crickets and the smell of growing things and the creek running in its channels in the dark. Their son was born in November of 1883. Ruby insisted on naming him George, and Raymond agreed immediately. And that was not a discussion so much as a statement of fact that Raymond recognized as exactly right. George Raymond Watkins arrived on a cold night with a midwife from town, and Raymond pacing the porch with his hands in his pockets, stopping every few minutes to look at the window as if he might be able to see something through it, until the midwife's assistant came out and told him to come in. The midwife placed the baby in Raymond's arms, and he stood very still in the lamplight in the house that Ruby's father had built, holding the weight of his son, and looked at Ruby on the bed watching him with her dark eyes, and the exhausted, complete expression of someone who has done something extremely difficult and knows it was exactly right. And he said softly, "George Raymond Watkins." "That is a very serious name for someone this small," Ruby said. "He will grow into it." He looked at the baby. The baby was, as babies are, extremely small and extremely determined looking, with Ruby's dark coloring and a general air of someone who has arrived and intends to stay. Raymond said, "Yes, I think you are right." George grew into his name with the vigor of a child raised on land that had been fought for and won, in a house where the work was real and the love was not decorative. He was curious and physical and stubborn, in a way that made both his parents laugh, with the recognition of people who know exactly where a trait comes from. He was following Ruby around the irrigated fields by the time he could walk, asking questions with the relentless interrogative energy of a person who will not accept vague answers. And he was following Raymond around the horses, by the time he was 3, with the particular reverence of someone who has found one of his fundamental things. Hector Vargas, who visited the Watkins claim with his family on various occasions, watched young George with cattle and horses and said to Raymond privately that the boy had it. Whatever the particular quality was that made a good rancher, and that he hoped Raymond understood he was building something that would last beyond himself. Raymond thought about his father's photograph on the shelf above the stove. He said, "I understand." In 1885, Hector Vargas offered Raymond a partnership in the ranch rather than a foreman's position, with the particular honesty of a man who recognizes what someone is worth and adjusts accordingly. Raymond brought the offer home and sat down with Ruby at the table, and they went through the numbers and the implications with their usual focused thoroughness, and then they looked at each other across the table. "It is a good offer," Ruby said. "It is," Raymond agreed. "But it is not what we are building," she said. He nodded slowly. "No, it is not. What they were building was their own. They had been building it since the first channel her father had planned, and it was taking shape with the accumulation of years and work. Not a cattle empire, nothing like Calloway, but something solid and honest and specifically theirs. The 160 acres had been expanded by 2 additional claims taken under the Homestead Act, land that bordered their original claim, and that was watered by the same system her father had designed, and that Ruby had extended. They ran a small cattle herd and kept horses. Raymond had kept his roan mare and had bred her twice, producing 2 foals that were the beginning of what would become a small but exceptional horse operation. They were growing. Raymond had declined Vargas's partnership offer respectfully, explaining his reasons honestly, and Vargas had looked at him with the expression of a man who expected exactly this answer and was not disappointed by it, and they had remained friends and close neighbors. The summer of 1885 brought a dry spell that lasted 8 weeks and tested every water system in the basin. Ruby's channels and the extended irrigation infrastructure that she and Raymond had built over 3 years proved their worth absolutely, while ranches and claims all around them were watching their water supplies drop. The Watkins land had the only properly engineered water distribution in the basin, and it held. It was during this dry period that Ruby found herself spending long evenings with her father's survey notes again, looking at the whole of the eastern basin's water and topography, and she began to see something that he had noted but never fully developed, the possibility of a larger communal water system that would serve multiple claims and ranches, reducing everyone's dependence on seasonal variability. She drew it out. It was ambitious. It would require cooperation from a dozen neighboring claim holders and ranchers, shared investment, shared maintenance, a degree of organized mutual trust that had been essentially impossible under Calloway's dominance and was now, with that dominance gone, potentially achievable. She brought it to the Cabo Rojo Basin's first community meeting, organized by Gerald Fitch, who had blossomed remarkably since Calloway's arrest into a man of genuine civic energy, and presented it with the same direct, documented thoroughness with which she had defended her claim at the land office 3 years earlier. Hector Vargas said, immediately, "I am in." The meeting took 3 hours and involved a great deal of argument, and several people saying it could not be done and Ruby explaining, point by point, why it could, with Raymond beside her providing the engineering detail whenever the conversation required it. By the end of the 3 hours, 9 of the 12 required parties had committed. The remaining 3 took another month of individual conversations, in which Ruby visited each of them at their own properties and answered their specific concerns with the particular patience of someone who believes in what she is proposing and is willing to make that case as many times as it needs to be made. The Cabo Rojo Basin Water Cooperative broke ground in the spring of 1886. It took 2 years to complete and cost everyone involved more than the original estimates, as such projects invariably do. Ruby managed the shared construction schedule with the organizational precision of her father's surveying mind, and Raymond managed the physical engineering of the main channel system with the careful structural attention that had correctly identified a beam load issue in their own porch 3 years earlier. Together, they held the project together through cost overruns and arguments between neighbors and 2 catastrophic sections of channel that had to be rebuilt from scratch due to soil conditions that were worse than the survey had predicted. When it was complete, in the fall of 1888, the Cabo Rojo Basin had a water system that no single drought could break, and every claim and ranch connected to it had measurably better prospects than they had had before. Gerald Fitch wrote up a formal description of it and sent it to the territorial government in Prescott as an example of cooperative infrastructure development, and someone there sent it further, and eventually it was referenced in a federal report on Western water management practices. Ruby Aldridge Watkins was credited as the principal architect of the system, which pleased her father's memory enormously in a way that she could feel and did not need to explain to anyone. George was 5 years old when the cooperative was completed, old enough to have strong opinions about everything, and to have developed his father's quality of watchful attention combined with his mother's quality of direct speech, which was a combination that his parents found alternately delightful and challenging. He had a horse of his own by this point, a small compact bay that he rode with the natural ease of someone for whom this was simply how you moved through the world, and he helped Ruby count the water levels in the channels every morning with the seriousness of an apprentice who understands that what they are learning matters. Ruby's second pregnancy, in the summer of 1887, had been harder than the first. She had been ill in the early months in a way she had not been with George, and it had frightened Raymond with a quiet intensity that he managed by being extremely useful riding to town for things she needed, reorganizing the household work so that she could rest during the worst of it, sitting up with her on the nights when she was most uncomfortable without making it into something dramatic or alarming, which was the kind of steady presence she had always needed, and which he had always understood how to provide. Their daughter was born in February of 1888, a cold month with snow on the ridge, healthy and very loud in her initial opinions about the world. They named her Clara, after Raymond's mother, who had died when he was 12, and about whom he had told Ruby one evening on the porch in enough detail that she had understood clearly how much that loss had shaped the man she married. Clara was, from the beginning, a person of particularly strong preferences and a complete willingness to express them, which Ruby looked at with the expression of someone who is seeing something very familiar, and Raymond looked at with the expression of someone who is having his own very particular form of poetic justice administered to him. George, presented with his sister, regarded her with the solemn assessment of a child who is taking a situation seriously, and then declared that she was very small but seemed like she might be acceptable, which Ruby and Raymond took as a characteristically Watkins endorsement. The years that followed were built of the same material as the years before, work and seasons, and the particular texture of a life that is genuinely your own. The Watkins claim grew and changed and improved. The horses Raymond raised became well known in the territory for their quality. His roan mare's line produced animals that combined her steadiness with her speed, and by 1890, he was selling horses to ranches as far as the New Mexico line and building a reputation that made people seek him out by name. Ruby continued to develop the land with her father's intelligence and her own addition to it, expanding the irrigation, trying new crops, keeping meticulous records of what worked and what did not in the particular conditions of that specific place. George turned 7 and then 8 and spent his summers working alongside both of them, absorbing everything with the comprehensive attention of a child who has had the extraordinary luck of growing up with parents who are fully present in the work of their own lives. He was a gentle boy with a fierce streak that emerged in defense of anything he considered unfair, which Raymond told Ruby privately was the most direct inheritance of either of them he could possibly imagine, and Ruby had laughed and said she took that as a high compliment. Clara walked at 10 months and talked at 18 and never seemed to stop either. She was drawn to the horses with an intensity that reminded Raymond powerfully of her mother's first regard for his roan mare at the livery. That complete, immediate recognition of a thing that belongs to you. And he began teaching her to ride when she was 3 on the most patient horse in the corral, watching her with the same focused attention that he brought to everything important. In the evenings, when the work was done and the children were settled and the house was warm with the lamp lit and the stove burning low, Raymond and Ruby sat on the porch that they had argued over and built together and talked, or did not talk, in the comfortable quiet of people who have nothing to prove to each other and a great deal to simply be in together. She still had her father's rifle on the wall. The Colt revolver was on the wall peg beside it. He kept his own rifle in the corner by the door. These were tools of the country they lived in, kept clean and properly maintained and used when necessary for legitimate purposes, and their presence was ordinary rather than dramatic in a house that had been through what this house had been through and knew what it knew. She thought about her father often, especially in the mornings when she was checking the channels and the water levels. His particular care and precision were everywhere in the original design, and she had extended his work but never changed its fundamental logic. She talked to George about his grandfather, and the stories she told were the ones her father had told her: how to read land, how to find water, how to stand still when something was trying to move you. George listened to those stories with the seriousness of a boy who understands he is being given something important. He asked questions that showed he was actually thinking about it. He asked once, when he was 8 years old, why their grandfather had not left when Calloway pressured him, and Ruby had thought about the answer for a moment and then said, "Because some things are worth fighting for, and your grandfather knew the difference between things that are and things that are not." George thought about this. Then he said, "Was it worth it, fighting for the claim?" Ruby looked at her son, this specific person who had come into the world because she had stood in her doorway with her father's rifle in October of 1882 and refused to move, and who now had brown eyes and his father's careful watchfulness and her own directness, and was sitting on the porch eating an apple in the morning light. "Yes," she said, unequivocally. Raymond came around the corner of the house just then, having heard the last exchange, and looked at the two of them on the porch and said, "What is unequivocal?" "Everything," Ruby said. He looked at her for a moment, that look, the complete one, the one she had first seen in the church on their wedding day, and had been seeing for almost a decade, and said, "Yes, I believe that is correct." The federal trial records of Burke Calloway were archived in Tucson and were never really spoken of in Cabo Rojo again, not because people had forgotten, but because the story had moved forward and the present was considerably more interesting than the past. Calloway served his sentence. He was released in 1897, an old man by then by any practical measure, and he settled in California and was never heard from in Arizona Territory again. Garrett was released 2 years earlier and moved to New Mexico. Neither of them was relevant to anything in Cabo Rojo after the day Marshal Voss arrived. The town itself grew through the 1880s with the slow accumulation that characterized Western towns that survived. A second general store, a proper school that no longer shared its building with the church, a doctor who arrived in 1887 and stayed, a newspaper that Gerald Fitch started as a one-page weekly in 1889, and which Mabel Crow contributed to with such enthusiastic regularity that she was effectively its society editor within the first year. The railroad came to the territory, but not specifically to Cabo Rojo, which some people lamented and others said was probably for the best. George Watkins, at 12 years old, was already the best young rider in the basin and showed every sign of being his father's son in every way that mattered about horses. He also showed, to his parents' quiet pride, a talent for numbers and for the kind of structural thinking that his mother applied to land and water. He had expressed a firm intention to study engineering when he was old enough, having read everything available on the subject in the school's library, and in the books his parents ordered periodically from publishers in the East. Clara, at 5, was a force of nature who primarily expressed herself through strong equestrian opinions and a habit of following her father into the corral regardless of whether she had been invited. Raymond had stopped even attempting to have the conversation about waiting and had instead adjusted his working process to include a small person who wanted to know everything about every horse and was not satisfied with incomplete answers. The spring of 1891 brought a letter from Raymond's brother in Texas, a man named Daniel Watkins, who had stayed in the state after their father's death and had been working other men's ranches ever since. The letter said that Daniel was thinking about moving west, that he had heard things about Arizona Territory, and that he was wondering whether Raymond had any suggestions about opportunities. Raymond read the letter twice and then handed it to Ruby without comment. She read it and looked at him. He was sitting at the table with his hands flat on the surface and looking at his father's photograph on the shelf, and she understood immediately the whole complex of feeling that was happening in him. The loss of the Texas ranch, his father, the brother he had not seen in 6 years, the particular accumulated weight of a man who has built something worth having and is now thinking about what it means to have someone to share it with. "Write him," she said. "He could work here," Raymond said carefully, feeling the idea out as he said it. "We have the horse operation to grow. I have been thinking about hiring someone I trust completely." "Write him," Ruby said again. "Tell him to come." He wrote that evening, and Daniel arrived 3 months later on the stage from Tucson, a man of 32 who looked like Raymond around the eyes and jaw, and who shook his brother's hand in the yard of the claim and looked out across the irrigated land and the horse corral and the house that had grown over 9 years into something substantial, and said, in the understated Texas way they had both inherited from their father, "You have done all right." Raymond said, "We have done all right." Daniel looked at Ruby, who was standing at Raymond's shoulder, and at George, who was leaning against the corral fence watching the new arrival with the assessing attention of his father, and at Clara on the porch, who was watching with equal assessment from her higher vantage point. "Your family is politely but comprehensively evaluating me," Daniel said. "They do that," Raymond said. "It is better than the alternative." Daniel stayed. He was good with horses. Not Raymond's extraordinary, instinctive good, but solid and patient and genuinely interested, and he learned quickly. He built himself a small house on the northern edge of the claim's expanded acreage by the end of his first winter, which suited everyone close enough to work together efficiently, far enough that 3 very independent adults were not in each other's way constantly. He became part of the fabric of the claim and the basin with the unpretentious ease of someone who has been somewhere worse and knows the difference. There was a third child, a boy they named Henry, born in 1892 in the summer, whose arrival was celebrated by the entire household including Clara, who immediately began discussing how she intended to teach him to ride at the earliest possible opportunity, and George, who said thoughtfully that 3 was a more complete number than 2, which was either mathematical or philosophical and possibly both. Henry arrived healthy and emphatic, and with Raymond's coloring, the first of the 3 to take after him in that particular way, and the house, already full, became fuller in the way that good things sometimes do. Not cramped but expanded, the walls accommodating more life without reducing anyone's space. The last decade of the 19th century was a period of consolidation and deepening for the Watkins claim. The horse operation grew into something genuinely notable. Raymond's roan mare had died in 1890 at an age that the veterinarian said was remarkable for a horse worked as hard as she had been, and Raymond had buried her on the north end of the property, with the matter-of-fact ceremony of someone saying goodbye to something that had carried him through the specific years when everything was decided. The line she had started continued in her offspring, and the Watkins horses were by 1895 sought after from as far as the Rio Grande. Ruby turned her attention in the mid-1890s to something she had been thinking about since the water cooperative was completed: documentation. Her father had been a surveyor and had kept meticulous records, and she had inherited both his records and his instinct for thorough documentation, and she had been keeping records of her own for years. The water levels, the yields, the seasonal patterns, the responses of different crops to different conditions in this specific place. She began writing them up formally, with the same precision her father had used, and sending them to the Territorial Agricultural Station that had opened in Tucson in 1891. The station's director, a man who had studied at an Eastern agricultural college, wrote back with questions, then with more questions, and eventually with an invitation to contribute to a bulletin on irrigation practices in the Arizona Territory. She wrote the piece at the table in the evenings while the children did their schoolwork and Raymond read or worked on equipment plans. And she did it with the thoroughness of a woman who had been building an argument for 9 years and knew exactly how strong her evidence was. The bulletin was published in 1896 and was distributed to territorial land offices and farming associations, and George, who was 13 and read everything, found a copy at the school and brought it home and said, with the pride of someone making an important announcement, "They printed your name on the front." Ruby looked at the bulletin, at her father's name in the acknowledgments section where she had put it, and said, "Good." The end of the 19th century found the Watkins family settled in the full, complete sense, not stationary, not finished, but established in a way that had depth to it, roots that had been grown deliberately over 18 years of specific choices. The claim was no longer just Ruby's father's 160 acres, but a 320-acre working property with a horse operation, a cattle herd, an established irrigation system that was part of the larger cooperative, and a house that had grown, through 3 separate expansions, into a genuine home with rooms for all 3 children and a covered porch on the eastern side, where the morning light came in best, and where Raymond and Ruby still sat in the evenings and talked. Or were quiet together, in the way of people who have learned each other all the way through. In January of 1900, they sat on that porch on a mild evening, mild even for January, which surprised no one who had spent time in Arizona Territory, and Ruby looked out at the land and the sky and the channels her father had planned and she had built and extended, and she felt the particular fullness that comes at the turn of a century, the sense of a long thread and where it has arrived. "My father wanted this kept," she said. Raymond looked at her. "He built it wanting it to last," she said. "I think it lasts." He looked out at the land with her, the irrigated strips dark against the paler scrubland, the horse corral with the night sounds of animals settling, the light in the bunkhouse where Daniel was, the light upstairs where George and Clara and Henry were, the whole accumulated evidence of 2 decades of choosing to stay. "It lasts," he said. She turned and looked at him. This man who had ridden onto her land to run her off it and had stayed, who had chosen the harder right thing at every fork in the road, who had built something with her that was more than either of them had known they were building when it started. She looked at him with the same complete, direct attention she had given to everything in her life that mattered, and he looked back at her the same way. And between them was 18 years of shared work and shared struggle and shared dailiness and shared love, which is the kind of love that does not announce itself with drama but simply deepens, like a channel cut by persistent water, into the permanent landscape of who you are. "I love you, Raymond Watkins," she said, the way she said everything simply, completely, without ornament. "I love you, Ruby Aldridge Watkins," he said in the same way. "I have since approximately the 4th morning." She laughed, that laugh he had been trying to cause since October of 1882, and he sat beside her on the porch they had built together, and the night came down over the Cabo Rojo Basin with its cold, clear stars, and the sound of the creek running through the channels in the dark. Above them, the window of the house showed its light out into the night. It had been on since the evening she received his letter. She had never thought to turn it off.